Hey there, welcome back. This is Felix from Goldhammer Vintage Watches. Most people know how the pocket watch evolved into the wristwatch, that Rolex originally comes from England, what was the first watch on the moon, the first watch on the bottom of the ocean. But in today's video, we want to introduce you to 5 interesting topics that you probably haven't heard before. So let's jump into it. Watchmaking craftsmanship has existed for centuries, and with such a rich history of timekeeping, there are many interesting little known facts about watches out there. Why do we wear our watches on the left wrist? What really means Swiss made on our dials? And how a Rolex watch helped to solve a murder case? It's getting really exciting. If you're not interested in all topics, you can also only pick out the ones that make you curious in the timeline below. So let's start with the first fact. Did you know that the world's first legal television commercial was aired by a watch company? Probably not. If you had asked me for the name of the company a week ago, I would have answered like 99% of the people with Rolex, Cartier and so on. But the answer is really surprising. This television commercial aired on the 1st July 1941 during a game between Brooklyn Dodgers and the Philadelphia Phillies. The ad was for Bulova watches, a company still in operation today. It lasted for only 10 seconds and aired on a local channel in New York called WNBT. This commercial cost somewhere between $4 to $9 to create, and with only 1% of the US homes having a TV set at the time, it didn't necessarily mean anything big for sales. Still, close to the 4,000 people watched the commercial when it first aired, completely revolutionizing the future of advertising. So let's head over to the second fact. Why is the number 4 in Roman numerals always written wrong? Owners of vintage or modern watches from all brands might have noticed that the 4th numeral on the dial, the one indicating 4 o'clock, isn't written in the traditional Roman way. Instead of the correct notation of 4, there are usually 4 dashes at the 4 o'clock position on the dial. But why do these different variations of the Roman numeral 4 exist? There's no single answer to this question. But here are 5 possible explanations we have found. In fact, the supposedly incorrect 4 is found on estimate 90% of all watches with Roman numerals instead of the correct 4. Third theory, in offense to Jupiter. The main god in the Roman world was Jupiter. At the time, the letter 1 stood for the J and the V for the U. Consequently, the 4 would have stood for JU and thus Jupiter. In ancient times, of course, one would not have wanted to presume to equate the banal number 4 with Jupiter, which is why people began to write the 4 as 4 dashes. Second theory, the French king Louis, also known as Louis the Great or the Sun King. The last French king before the revolution has agreed that 4 dashes were the only way to write the number 4. The theory is very credible because during his more than 70-year reign, he played a major role in shaping French fashion and made France's model of fashion famous in whole Europe. Third, it was the earliest way to write the 4. In fact, it's not quite correct to call the 4 dashes notation wrong. In early mathematics, numbers were only used to count. The 4 was represented with only 4 fingers or 4 lines. Fact number 4. People can't read. When the first clocks appeared, most of the people were not able to read. So the 4 dashes are much easier to understand. According to the German Watch Museum, it is just easier and, more importantly, faster for the human brain to calculate 1 4 times than 5 minus 1. And last but not least, theory number 5, the visual balance. The last possible explanation is the most rational of them all, and thus probably the most plausible too. Clocks and wristwatches usually show the time in 12 hours. 12 digits are thus printed on their dials. One of the reasons for using 4 dashes could easily be to achieve greater visual balance. So let's jump into our third main fact. How a Rolex watch helped to solve a murder case. Most owners of used Rolex watches probably assume that their watches will never do anything more for them than tell the time of the day. However, for Ronald Platt, it was his Rolex Datejust that allowed the police to identify his body and immediately catch the killer. Albert Johnson Walker, Ronald Platt's business partner, took him out to a fishing trip in 1969 where he murdered Platt, tied his body with an anchor and dumped it into the sea. 2 weeks later, a local fishing boat discovered Platt's body in one of their nets. Due to the amount of time that had it spent on the bottom of the ocean, his body was unidentifiable. Despite the poor condition of the body itself, thanks to its oyster case, Platt's Rolex watch remained watertight and largely unaffected by its time underwater, which allowed the police to gather their first clue. By using the unique serial number on the case of the watch and the internal service record that was marked on the inside of its case back, they were able to trace the watch back to Ronald Platt as the last owner. Additionally, the power reserve of Platt's Rolex was known to be 48 hours. So the police were able to determine the date of the death within a reasonable margin of error by subtracting the watch's power reserve from the date that was displayed on the watch when it was found. According to his Rolex watch, Ronald Platt was murdered on July the 20th in 1996. Number 4. Why we wear our watches on the left wrist? We just think that's where it belongs. But what is the reason for this mindset? We find 4 answers to this question. About 10% of the population is left-handed, and it was not unusual that left-handers get forced to write with their right hand when they started school. To hit the nail on the head, no, a watch does not have to be worn on the left wrist. The right wrist is just as good. The reason most people still wear their watch on the left wrist is simple. A watch can get in the way of writing or other actions like, for example, sports, and because of the majority of people are right-handed, they wear the watch on the left. Another advantage for many people is that you easily can wind the watch. Then you don't have to take it off every time, for example, to change the time or possibly the date. But there's also a historical point of view. Before the 19th century, wristwatches were only worn by women, while men owned a pocket watch. Especially soldiers used them. Officers stowed their pocket watches in small leather pouches and wrapped them around their left, non-dominant wrists. This way of wearing watches was then transferred to wearing wristwatches in the early 19th century. So let's jump into our last fact for today. Swiss-made on our watches does not necessarily mean that our watch was 100% made in Switzerland. Swiss-made. We can find this designation on almost of all our luxury watches. For me, this means that the watch is 100% made in Switzerland. But like so often in life, it doesn't always contain what is written on it. Instead, it indicates that the watch meets certain high quality standards in the form of Swiss trademark law. Previously, Swiss law established 3 conditions that had to be fulfilled in order to call a watch Swiss-made. First, the movement of the watch was Swiss. Second, the movement was encased in Switzerland. And third, the final inspection of the watch was carried out by the manufacturer in Switzerland. Unfortunately, these conditions were often exploited and many loopholes were explored by cheaper manufacturers. But what means the movement of the watch was Swiss? According to previous regulations, what constitute a Swiss watch movement was as follows. Its production was in Switzerland, its final inspection was carried out by the manufacturer in Switzerland, and at least 50% of the value of the movement's components were manufactured in Switzerland. So this 50% allowed manufacturers to import cheap parts from Asia and to mix them with Swiss components, subsequently labeling their watches Swiss-made, meaning that a watch with lower quality parts could be sold as a luxury item, misleading customers into thinking they had a genuine Swiss watch. To solve this problem, in 2017, not far ago, new regulations were put into place to tighten the law on what makes a watch Swiss-made. They are the follows. At least 60% of the whole watch production costs must be incurred in Switzerland. At least 50% of the value of the movement's components must be manufactured in Switzerland. At least 60% of the movement's manufacture must be concluded in Switzerland, and the technical design of the watch and its movement must be developed in Switzerland. The new regulations have strengthened the Swiss brand, but there's still room for improvement. According to the Gabriel Group, the Federation of Swiss Watch Industry is considering further tightening Swiss trademark law by increasing the percentage of production costs that is genuinely based in Switzerland and at least 80%. So that's all from today. We hope that these 5 facts were as exciting for you as for us. And yeah, if you know any other exciting facts about the world of vintage watches or watches, please let us know in a comment for maybe a new video. So have a great day and hope to see you in our next one.